It is the 14th of December, 1799, and the most powerful man in America is drowning. Not in water, in himself. His throat swelled nearly shut in the night, and now every breath he drags in sounds like a saw pulled slowly across wet wood. He is 67 years old, a giant of a man, and he is afraid, though he is far too proud to say so. Around his bed stand 3 physicians, good men, learned men, the best that money and reputation can summon to a Virginia estate on a cold morning, and they are in complete, confident agreement about what will save his life. They are going to open his veins and let his blood run out into a bowl, not a little of it. Over the next 12 hours or so, by the best modern estimates, they will draw off something like 2 1/3 liters of it, roughly 40% of all the blood in his body. They are not butchers. They are not fools. They love this man. They are watching him fade, hour by hour, and they are doing the single most respectable, most current, most widely endorsed thing a physician could possibly do in the year 1799, and it is almost certainly helping to kill him. His name is George Washington, and this is the story of the cure that helped bleed a president to death. I should introduce myself before we go any further because I have a particular way of looking at a story like this one. My name is Hollis. For a very long working life, I was a coroner and a pathologist, which is a polite way of saying that when a person died and someone needed to know honestly why, I was the one who found out. I spent decades in quiet, well-lit rooms with the people the living had run out of answers for. And that work does something to how you hear a sentence like the one I just told you. Because when I hear that 3 good doctors drained 40% of a man's blood while trying to save him, I do not hear villains. I hear the sound of medicine being done exactly as it was supposed to be done. Correctly, carefully, lethally. That is the thing I want you to sit with across the next half hour or so. Not that the past was full of monsters. The opposite. That it was full of clever, dedicated, respected people who were confidently, sincerely wrong for a very long time about something that cost a great many lives. I have signed a lot of certificates in my time. I have learned to be careful about the word cure. So let me take you back, gently and honestly, into 2,000 years of one of the strangest ideas medicine ever believed in. And let me be clear, right at the top, because it matters. Everything I am about to tell you is history, not advice. Nothing here is a recommendation. It is a story about how people used to think and what it cost them. So, bloodletting. Let us say the word plainly, because it deserves to be understood before it is judged. Bloodletting is the deliberate draining of a patient's blood in the belief that removing it will cure or prevent illness. That is all it is. A doctor, meaning well, opening a vein and letting some measured amount of a sick person's blood flow away, and genuinely expecting them to get better for it. And here is the part that stops me every time, even now. This was not a fad. This was not some brief medieval madness that flared up and burned out. Bloodletting was mainstream, respectable medicine for more than 2,000 years. We can trace it from the physicians of ancient Greece, through the Roman world, through the great medical schools of the Islamic Golden Age, through medieval Europe, through the Renaissance, right up into the 1800s. Think about the sheer span of that. For most of recorded history in most of the Western world, if you fell seriously ill, one of the very first things a competent, caring doctor would do was reach for something to open a vein. It outlasted empires. It outlasted languages. It was simply what medicine was. But no idea survives that long by accident. So you have to ask the honest question. Why? Why would intelligent people do this? generation after generation, century after century. And the answer is that they had a theory, a beautiful, tidy, completely wrong theory. It was called humoral medicine, and to understand it you have to set aside everything you know about germs and cells and organs, because they knew none of it. Instead, they believed the human body was governed by 4 fluids, 4 humors. There was blood, there was phlegm, there was yellow bile, and there was black bile, and health in this way of thinking was balance. When your 4 humors sat in their proper proportion, you were well. When one of them ran to excess, when you had too much of one, you fell ill. Fever, a flushed face, a pounding pulse, inflammation. To the humoral physician, that was not a mystery. That was a body with too much blood in it, an excess, a surplus. And if the problem is a surplus of blood, then the solution writes itself, doesn't it? You remove some. You restore the balance. You take away the excess, and in theory, you take the sickness away with it. It is, I want you to notice, a genuinely logical system. Given the premise, the treatment follows perfectly. The trouble was never the logic. The trouble was that the premise was a fantasy. There is no surplus of blood making you feverish. The 4 humors do not exist as they imagined them, but it hung together so neatly, it explained so much, that it convinced the finest minds in medicine for the better part of 2 millennia. A wrong idea that makes sense is far more dangerous than a wrong idea that sounds absurd. This one made perfect sense, and it reached into far more than illness. This is the part I find genuinely lovely, in a melancholy way. The 4 humors were thought to shape your whole character, your very temperament. If blood ran strong in you, you were sanguine, warm and cheerful and hopeful. Too much phlegm and you were phlegmatic, calm and slow and cool. An excess of yellow bile made you choleric, quick to anger. And black bile, the darkest of them, made you melancholic, sad and brooding and heavy. Those 4 words, sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, melancholic, are still in our language today. When you call someone melancholy, you are speaking the language of the humors, 24 centuries later, without knowing it. So this was not some narrow clinical footnote. It was a complete picture of what a human being was. Body, mood, health, and soul, all of it explained by the balance of 4 fluids. And if the fluids explained everything, then adjusting the fluids could fix anything. That is how total the idea was. That is why it did not let go. And it had a champion. If you want to understand how bloodletting became untouchable, you have to meet a physician named Galen. Galen worked in the Roman world in the 2nd century after Christ, patching up gladiators and later tending emperors. He was brilliant, he was tireless, and he wrote an enormous amount of it down. And Galen was a devoted believer in the humors and a great enthusiast for letting blood. He worked out elaborate rules for it, which vein for which complaint, how much to take, when in the illness to do it. He turned a folk practice into a system with the weight of a science. Now here is what happened next, and it is the truly remarkable part. Galen became an authority, not an authority, the authority. For something like 1400 years after his death, European and Islamic medicine treated Galen's writings as very nearly sacred. To question Galen was close to heresy. Doctors did not test his claims against the patient in front of them. They memorized him. And so his enthusiasm for the Lancet did not fade with him. It was copied and taught and copied again, carried forward across 1,000 years and more, gathering the authority of every great name that endorsed it along the way. By the time it reached George Washington's bedside, bloodletting was not one doctor's opinion. It was the settled wisdom of the entire history of medicine. That is a very hard thing to argue with, standing at a dying man's bedside on a cold morning. So how was it actually done? I will tell you, plainly and without dwelling on it because you should know, but I have no interest in making you wince for its own sake. There were, broadly, a few ways. The most common was to open a vein directly, usually at the arm with a small blade. There were specialized instruments for exactly this. There was the lancet, a small, sharp, folding blade that gives its name, incidentally, to one of the most famous medical journals in the world to this day. And there was the Fleam, a sturdier instrument, sometimes with several blades of different sizes folded into a case like a pocket knife. A vein would be opened, and a measured amount of blood allowed to flow into a bowl, often a shallow bleeding bowl marked so the physician could judge the quantity. Then it was bound up. That was the core of it. Simple, quick, and done in ordinary homes as routinely as we might take a temperature. There was a second method, called cupping. In its gentler form, a warmed cup was placed against the skin, and as the air inside cooled, it drew the skin up into the cup, bringing blood to the surface. That was the version that left no wound. There was also a version meant to actually draw blood out through small scratches in the skin, and I will leave the description there, because the point is not the detail. The point is the intent. In every case the goal was the same. Move the blood, draw it out, correct the imagined excess. And then there is the method everybody remembers, the one that has become almost a joke, a shorthand for old, backward medicine. The leech. A particular species, the medicinal leech, Hirudo medicinalis, was prized for this. You would apply the leech to the skin. It would attach and feed, and it would draw off a small quantity of blood on its own, painlessly, which is part of why they were so popular for delicate places and delicate patients. Now, if you are picturing this as some rare, fringe thing, let me correct you, because the scale of it is genuinely staggering, and it is the detail that made me put my coffee down the first time I read it properly. In the early 1800s, Europe went, and I use the word people at the time used, mad for leeches. Historians talk about a leech mania. Demand became so enormous that France alone, by the accounts we have, was importing something on the order of tens of millions of leeches every single year in the 1830s. Tens of millions. In a single country. In a single year. They were harvested from ponds and marshes until the wild populations began to collapse. There were leech farms. There were leech shortages. An entire small industry grew up around feeding Europe's absolute conviction that draining blood was the road to health. And I need you to understand something that makes the scale of it make sense, because otherwise the numbers seem impossible. Bloodletting was not only for the sick. It was preventive. It was routine. Healthy people were bled on a schedule, the way you might get a checkup, to keep the humors in trim and ward off illness before it came. There were calendars and almanacs advising the best times to be bled. Spring was considered a natural time for it, a sort of seasonal cleaning out. Monasteries bled their monks regularly as a matter of discipline and health. People of means might be bled several times a year simply as maintenance, feeling perfectly well, because everyone knew it was good for you. So when I tell you tens of millions of leeches a year, remember that they were not all going onto the gravely ill. A great many were going onto ordinary, healthy people, on an ordinary afternoon, keeping up with the wisdom of the age. Sit with that for a second. An entire civilization, calmly and regularly, drawing the blood of well people to keep them well. And this is where I get to give you my favorite piece of everyday history, the kind of thing that once you know it, you can never unsee. Picture the barber's pole, that spiraling red and white striped pole that still turns outside barbershops today. Have you ever wondered why a place you go for a haircut advertises itself with red and white stripes? Here is why. For centuries, the person who cut your hair and the person who let your blood were often the same man. The barber surgeon. He had the sharp blades and the steady hand, and so, alongside shaves and haircuts and pulling teeth, he did minor surgery and, yes, routine bloodletting. And the pole is a memorial to exactly that. The most common telling is this. The red is the blood. The white is the clean bandage. And the pole itself represents the staff the patient would grip in his fist to make the veins of the arm stand out. So the next time you pass a barber shop and that cheerful little pole is turning, understand that you are looking at one of the last quiet monuments to 2,000 years of bloodletting, spinning away in plain sight and almost nobody knows. History does that. It hides in the ordinary. But let me take you back to that bedside in Virginia, because it is the case that says everything, and it deserves to be told carefully and with respect for the frightened, dying man at the center of it. George Washington, retired now from the presidency, had spent a raw December day out on his estate in the wet and the snow. By that night he had a sore throat. By the small hours he was seriously, frighteningly ill. His airway was swelling shut, some sort of severe infection of the throat, the kind of thing that today would very likely be a manageable problem. He could barely breathe and he could barely speak. And here is a detail I never fail to mention, because it is the one that tells you this was not something done to Washington against the run of the times. It was Washington himself, the story goes, who called early for the bleeding to begin. He believed in it. Before his physicians even arrived, an overseer on the estate opened a vein and drew blood at Washington's own insistence, because that is what everyone knew you did for a serious illness. Then the physicians came, one after another, 3 of them in the end, and they conferred and they agreed and they bled him again, and again, and again, across roughly 12 hours. By the best modern reconstructions, the total blood removed came to something like 2 1/3 liters. To give you a sense of that, an adult body holds only around 5 liters in all. So they took, very roughly, 40% of his blood in half a day from a 67-year-old man who was already fighting for his life. And it was not only the bleeding. He was blistered, his skin deliberately raised to draw out the illness. He was purged. He was given things to make him vomit. Every tool in the well-stocked medical kit of 1799 was turned on him, in earnest by men straining to save him. And that evening he died. Now I have to be very careful here, and I want you to watch me be careful, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a lazy telling would overreach. Did the bloodletting kill George Washington? The honest answer is that I cannot stand here and tell you that with certainty, and neither can anyone else. He had a severe infection that, on its own, might well have taken his life even with everything we know today. That has to be said. But the considered judgment of many modern physicians who have looked back at the case is this. Draining that much blood, that fast, from a critically ill and dehydrated older man did not help him, and very likely made things worse. It very probably hastened his death. That is the modern reading. Hastened, not simply caused. I am giving you the careful word on purpose, because the difference between hastened and caused is the difference between history and a cheap headline, and I would rather be accurate than dramatic. But sit with even the careful version for a moment. The father of a country, surrounded by the best medical minds available to him, asking for and receiving the finest care of his age, and that care itself may have carried him out the door faster. Nobody in that room did anything a good doctor of the time would have called wrong. That is what makes it a tragedy rather than a crime. And Washington is not the only figure worth naming here, because just a few years earlier, in the same young country, there was a physician who took bloodletting about as far as anyone in America ever took it. His name was Benjamin Rush. You should know that Rush was not a crank on the margins. He was one of the most celebrated physicians in America, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a teacher, a reformer, a man of real conscience who stayed in the city to treat the poor when others fled. Remember that because it matters. In 1793, the city of Philadelphia was struck by a horrifying epidemic of yellow fever. People were dying in their thousands, and Rush, searching desperately for something that worked, became convinced that the answer was aggressive treatment, heavy purging, and heavy bleeding. He bled his patients copiously, and he bled a great many of them in the middle of a plague with the city in terror around him. So did he help, or did he harm? And here I have to flag it clearly, because the honest answer is that it was fiercely disputed at the time, and it is still disputed now. Rush himself was utterly convinced he was saving lives, and he pointed to his recoveries as proof. Critics, including some sharp voices of his own day, argued he was weakening desperately sick people and hastening deaths. Modern eyes tend to side with the critics on the medicine, that draining the blood of patients ravaged by yellow fever was far more likely to harm than to help. But I will not pretend the ledger is simple or fully settled, and I will not turn a sincere and courageous man into a cartoon. He acted with conviction, inside the framework he trusted, in a genuine emergency. That the framework was wrong is the whole sorrow of the thing, which brings me to the question that a coroner cannot help but ask. The real question underneath all of this. If bloodletting mostly did nothing and often actively harmed, then how on earth did it survive for 2,000 years? How does a wrong treatment last that long? I have thought about this a great deal, and I think the answer comes in 3 parts, and I think all 3 of them should make us a little uneasy about ourselves. The first part is the one we have already met. Authority. Galen said so, and the whole towering weight of medical tradition said so after him. And for most of history, medicine advanced by trusting the great names of the past rather than testing them. When everyone you respect, and everyone they respected, has done a thing for 1,000 years, it takes an extraordinary kind of nerve to stand at a bedside and say, perhaps all of us have been wrong. The second part is quieter and, to my mind, far more dangerous. It is what we would now call confirmation bias, though they had no name for it. Think about what a doctor actually saw. He bled a patient, and some of those patients got better afterward. Most illnesses, after all, get better on their own. The body heals, and when a patient recovered, the doctor did not think they recovered despite me. He thought the treatment worked. The bleeding was remembered as the cure, and when a patient died, well, the illness was simply too strong or they had come to him too late. Every recovery was evidence for bloodletting. Every death was excused. The treatment could never lose because the human mind had quietly rigged the scoring. That right there is the trap, not stupidity. A perfectly ordinary mind, drawing the wrong lesson from what it honestly saw. And the third part is simply the patients who recovered anyway. For every person the bleeding weakened, there was another who would have recovered no matter what, and who walked away praising the doctor and the lancet that had, in truth, done nothing but slow them down. The successes were loud. The failures were buried, quite literally, and buried failures do not write testimonials. I knew a colleague long ago, a fine and gentle man, who once fainted clean away during a difficult case early in his training, and stayed a little embarrassed by it for the rest of his career. I used to tell him it was the most honest thing his body ever did. It knew, before his mind caught up, that something was wrong. And that is exactly the instinct the old system quietly switched off. A physician bleeding a patient toward the grave felt no such faintness, because the theory told him this was help. The framework overruled the flinch. A framework that can talk you out of your own horror is a powerful and a perilous thing, and the people in this story were not missing some feeling that you happen to have. They simply had a story about what they were seeing that was strong enough to quiet it. So do you. So do I. That thought should give all of us pause. I had an assistant once years ago, a bright, squeamish young man named Toby, who used to go a particular shade of gray whenever the older instruments came up in conversation. And Toby asked me a fair question once. He asked whether all of it, every last bit of it, was pure nonsense, whether taking blood ever made any sense at all. And the honest answer, the careful answer, is not quite as tidy as the joke would like it to be. So let me flag this too, purely as a matter of historical and factual fairness, and I will say it once more because I mean it, as nothing remotely like advice. The truth is that drawing off blood, and even the medicinal leech, did not vanish completely and for all purposes. In a very small number of narrow, specific, genuinely understood situations, controlled removal of blood, and in certain delicate procedures the medicinal leech, survive in legitimate modern practice, for reasons that have nothing to do with balancing four humors and everything to do with things we now actually understand. I mention it only so that you have the full and accurate picture, and so no one can say I painted it simpler than it was. The point is not that removing blood is always meaningless. The point is that for 2,000 years it was done for the wrong reasons, to the wrong people, in the wrong amounts for almost everything, on the strength of a theory that was simply not true. Getting the right answer occasionally, for the wrong reason, is not the same as being right. And now I want to make the turn that this whole story has been building toward, because it is the part that actually matters, and it is the part the jokes always miss. It would be so easy and so comfortable to file all of this under stupidity, to picture bloodletting as the work of leering quacks and back-alley charlatans, and to sit back, safe and modern and superior, and laugh. But that picture is a lie, and I have spent too long around the truth to let you leave with a lie. These were not cartoon villains. The people bleeding their patients were, overwhelmingly, the most respected, most educated, most sincerely dedicated healers of their day. They were the professors. They were the ones the powerful sent for. They had studied for years. They genuinely, deeply wanted their patients to live, and when a patient died under the Lancet, they grieved, and then they went out the next morning and did the very same thing to the next patient because they were sure. Not careless. Sure. That is the whole horror of it, and it is a quiet horror, not a lurid one. For 2,000 years, earnest, brilliant, respected people, working with the best framework their age could give them, confidently did a thing that mostly did not work and often did harm, and they did it believing every day that they were on the side of life. The tragedy of medical history is almost never wickedness. It is sincerity, pointed in the wrong direction, and armed. And this is the part where I turn away from the past for a moment and turn, gently, to you. Because I did not walk you through 2,000 years of a lethal mistake just so you could feel clever about living now. In all my years signing certificates and giving families the true reason, the lesson that settled deepest into me was not about the dead. It was about certainty. Every doctor at Washington's bedside was certain. Galen was certain. Benjamin Rush, bleeding the sick of Philadelphia while the city emptied around him, was heartbreakingly certain. Certainty is not a feeling that tracks whether you are right. It is just a feeling. And it felt exactly the same to them, standing over a dying man with a lancet, as your certainties feel to you right now. So here is the question I would like you to actually sit with, and it is not a comfortable one. What are we all doing today, right now, with total confidence, backed by the best experts and the settled wisdom of our age, that some coroner 100 years from now will read about and quietly shake her head at? What is our bloodletting? Because there is something. There is always something. Every generation is convinced it has finally left the dark ages behind, and every generation is partly wrong and does not yet know which part. The people in this story were not more foolish than us. They were us, working with less. And the only thing that separates our confidence from theirs is time, and how much of it has passed, and how much has not passed yet. The humility in that is not a weakness. It is, I think, the beginning of actual wisdom. Hold your certainties a little more loosely. Ask now and then how you would know if you were wrong. It is the one lesson 2,000 years of good intentions and open veins can still teach us, if we are willing to be taught by it. And that is exactly what I would love to hear from you down in the comments, because I do read them, and this one I am genuinely curious about. What do you think it is? What is something we do today, confidently, that you suspect the future will look back on the way we look back on bloodletting? A food we are sure about, a habit, a treatment, a thing everyone just knows. Tell me what you think our descendants will shake their heads at. I want to read your answers. For my part, I will keep doing what old coroners do, which is telling you the true and careful reasons behind things, one story at a time, and trying never to be too sure of anything but the evidence in front of me. If you would like to sit in on the next one, and there are a great many of these stories left to tell, then do subscribe, and I will keep them coming. This has been a story about good people doing their sincere best with a wrong idea for 2,000 years. Be a little kinder to the past than the jokes allow, and be a little more careful with your own certainties than feels comfortable. My name is Hollis. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you at the next one.